Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. The usual narrative for the Second World War is that the turning points of the war are in 1942 with the battles of Midway, El Alamein and Stalingrad. While these are unquestionably major victories that signalled the end of the beginning, as Churchill put it, friend of the podcast Andrew Nagorski has suggested that actually 1941 was the pivotal year of the war. He contends that the decisions made in 1941 by the major nations will make an Allied victory not just possible, but inevitable. It's a compelling idea. As we've had Andrew on before, back in episode 18, I thought it would be good to get him back for a catch-up and to outline his thesis laid out in his new book, 1941, the Year Germany Lost the War. Now, if you enjoy the podcast, I wonder if you've ever considered becoming a patron. Patrons of the podcast do get access to extras, off-topic bits of conversation that I have with guests. That's just in case you don't get enough World War II talk. For as little as $1 or so a month, you can help me find the time to put aside to produce the podcast. You can find out more at patreon.com/WW2podcast. And it's a big thank you to those who already support the show. So let's crack on. Andrew, welcome back. You suggest that the decisive year during World War II is 1941. We can pick through the details, but why, briefly, why is 1941 so important?
I think 41 is absolutely critical because if you just look at the situation at the beginning of 41 and at the end of 41. In the space of that year, you go from a situation where, of course, Britain was still alone. The Blitz was on. Its shipping was being attacked by German U-boats. The Soviet Union was still officially in the Nazi-Soviet pact. So Stalin was supplying Hitler with vital supplies, all sorts of things, natural resources, oil, everything he needed for his war effort. The U.S. was officially neutral on the sidelines, although, of course, FDR was very much supportive of the British side. But there was a very strong isolationist movement in the U.S. led by people like Charles Lindbergh. And if you look at that situation in the beginning of 41, and Churchill actually made this point in his memoirs, this was the toughest period of the war for him, the most uncertain period. You always talk about the Battle of Britain and the Blitz, but the Battle of Britain had been transformed into the Blitz. It was continuing from the German point of view. The German generals and economists and others who had told Hitler all along, before Czechoslovakia, before Poland, before the attack on Western Europe and particularly on France, watch it, you're overextending yourself. They had all been proven wrong. And there was almost a sense of infallibility about Hitler, that he defied everybody who said you're overreaching. And he really believed that he could win. And many other people believed he could win. And many people in Britain and the U.S. were far from convinced that Britain could hold out. Joseph Kennedy, who had been the U.S. ambassador to Britain through 1940, was still officially ambassador in early 41, although he had left Britain at that point, had been telling everybody Britain had no chance against Germany and should just try to cut a deal. You start the year with that. By the end of the year, you have Britain not far from alone. It's got two new powerful allies, the Soviet Union and the United States. Of course, the reasons for that we can get into is Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union in June of 41. Then the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and Hitler declares war on the United States. And as one German historian has put it, suddenly Hitler had declared war on the whole world. And when you declare war on the whole world, eventually that catches up with you. You look at the resources of what you've got on your side and what the whole world has on its side, and things don't look too good. I mean, even though Churchill later would say, if we talk about the turning point, the beginning of the end later, he already in late 41 would say, we have basically after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and he realized this new alignment, that Britain was going to survive. Hitler his fate was sealed, and it was no longer just rhetoric. I think he really believed that.
Well, you mentioned economics there. Shall we start with that? In 1939, the Reich Minister, was he Sherwin von Krogzig? Is that how we pronounce it?
Yes.
He made predictions about future war with Britain, which I thought was interesting that anyone's even bothered to do a report on it. How conclusive or how damning was his report on what war with Britain would be like from an economic point of view for Germany?
Well, the point was that he and others, including General Thomas, who was the Wehrmacht's chief economist and logistics guy, were working on the assumption that the United States, even though it was out of the war, that the resources of the United States would be the disposal of Britain eventually. So therefore, looking at that comparison, while Germany was already straining, it was using about 23% of its GDP, if I recall correctly, at the time for military purposes. Britain at that point, I think, was about 12%. The U.S. was 2%. The potential for growth was far greater on the other side. And this is a consistent theme that I discuss in my book, is that every time you had people within the Wehrmacht or the government, and later from the embassy, the German embassy in Moscow, saying, look at the relative strength and depth of manpower, natural resources, and so forth of your potential opponents. And there's no way Germany can win a protracted war. But what's interesting here is that Hitler hears this stuff and takes it in the exact opposite way that it was intended. He has his own, what is called what you would say, perverse logic, mad logic. But there is a logic to his thinking. He said, if we're going to be outgunned, outproduced, outmanned in the long run, we got to win in the short run. So everything has to be escalated. And so he acts like a compulsive gambler. He says, if I have a setback in one place, I'm going to escalate and raise the stakes in another place. I'm doubling down, tripling down. And what happens throughout 41 is that's what he does. When he cannot subjugate Britain, and of course everything starts with the fact that Britain refuses under Churchill to cut a deal, to surrender, to whatever you want to call it, to pull a Vichy. And the U.S. begins to provide more and more supplies under the Lend-Lease Act, which passes in early 41. He then decides, okay, if I can't subdue Britain right now, I'll go back to my original long-term goal, which I've spelled out in Mein Kampf and any number of speeches. The German Empire lies to the east. We can't have an overseas empire the way Britain does. We can't, but we need Lebensraum, which means living space, the resources of the East, and that's mainly Russia, Ukraine, and the vast expanse there, and his vision of this being the great new frontier for Germany and German conquest and the German Empire. And he says, okay, well, I will turn against Stalin and defeat the Soviet Union. And once that's done, Britain under Churchill believes that eventually they may be able to get the Russians on our side. If they see that the Russians are crushed, then they will surrender, essentially. Once the U.S. sees how things are going, they will, whatever thoughts they have of engaging in the long term, will also dissipate, and they're gonna wash their hands of everything that happens in Europe. So he has this thing that every time he rationalizes that these are economic arguments for fighting stand them on their head and say, let's escalate further.
It's funny. Do you think he just didn't have any appreciation for the economics, or he just didn't want to see it? He just thought if he played his gambler's hand, he'd get round it, because, it underlays, everything that happens in Russia. It comes down to logistics and supply and economic producing things. If you look at, everyone likes to draw the parallels with Napoleon marching on Moscow, but even Napoleon appreciated how big Russia was, and it was the biggest logistics operation that the French had ever put on, and they still came unstuck. Yet Hitler just doesn't seem to want to engage with the economic argument. Is that it? Do you think he just didn't want to see it, so he rationalised it a different way and played his gambler's hand?
Yeah, it was a contradiction with Hitler always. On the one hand, he said the essence of Nazi ideology, such as it is racial. We are going to conquer the East and the Untermenschen, the subhumans of the East, and enslave them and colonize them. And that was somehow going to produce the vast resources that Germany needed, which in the long term would make it this powerful empire and overcome those economic constraints. But it was crazy from the beginning when you think about it. First of all, Germany was already getting so much from the Soviet Union on the terms of the Nazi-Soviet pact. Hitler did not think, well, if we actually invade, it's not that we're going to keep getting it in those steady deliveries. And in Hitler's mind, he's just going to take everything. But what will there be to take? And what will be, what will be the cost of trying to take it? He just put that out of his mind. And at one point, Hermann Goering told some of the top officials, don't worry about the economic part of the equation. We'll take care of it, whatever that means. And the same thing with the disproportion in manpower. If you look at the population of the Soviet Union alone, it was about twice what it was of Germany. So you got to know that in a long-term battle, they're going to be able to throw a lot more troops in against the German army. Again, Hitler's response to that was, well, the German army is at its peak now, so therefore it should attack now. Russia is weak now, which it was in many ways, and suffering from the aftermath of the purges, where the top officer corps had been decimated, and other actions. So again, everything becomes a rationale for striking out harder, faster, further than would seem at all logical to an outside observer.
As we're discussing Russia, I just wondered how the decision to actually launch Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia. You mentioned he's laid it out years in advance, his racial policy in Mein Kampf. But do you think people actually looked at that book and think he'd actually carry it out in 1941?
Well, one of the interesting things about Mein Kampf is that a lot of people talked about it. Very few people had read it. It's a very turgid, huge tome. The evidence indicates that Stalin had at least read some of the sections on Russia and other interpretations of Hitler's speeches. But there was this tendency, and it was not just in terms of Hitler's claims about what he would do with Russia, but of course his claims what he would do with the Jews. There was a sort of almost an unwillingness of many people to believe he meant what he was saying literally. Said, this is too absurd, too macabre to believe that he really means this word for word. I think people read it in some cases. In other cases, they didn't even bother to read it. They said, oh, we've got the summary of his views. But this is almost as if, Hitler is talking to his base. He makes these grandiose claims, and which his electorate loves. But we shouldn't take it very seriously. I think with Stalin, though, it was a case of also willful blindness. Hitler had his own willful blindness to the fact that he was going down a path that eventually there was no salvation for him. So he just kept convincing himself, and people around him who had been proven wrong no longer dared contradict him, that every gamble he would result in victory. while Stalin, because he was traumatized by various other fears and so forth, he had his forces, for instance, had invaded Finland and at the end of 1939 and taken quite a beating before they managed to force the Finns to peace terms. So it was a sense that the Red Army also was not well prepared, and its equipment was not well prepared, and Stalin made all sorts of mistakes in terms of deployment of his troops. He was worried about allowing Hitler to believe he was preparing for war, since he wanted so much for this Nazi-Soviet pact to continue at least for another year or so, that he did not permit his troops to be on alert. He did not prepare adequate defenses. Famously, when Germany finally invaded, the Air Force was lined up in very neat rows, very close to the border, making for easy targets. So it was almost as if you had two tyrants competing for the title of the world's most willfully blind dictator or tyrant. I think my first thought of how to word that was basically much more crass than that. Just say, who could be the most stupid dictator? And in fact, Hitler was supposedly the brilliant one, and then soon won that contest. Stalin initially made the huge mistakes with his troops being unprepared and for the onslaught, and Hitler sends his troops in even without winter uniforms, thinking it's going to be such a quick campaign, and of course they pay the price for that later. Eventually, in the long-term equation of the relative strength of their economies, of their manpower, and so forth, and Stalin beginning to learn from some of his mistakes, as opposed to Hitler, who does not learn anything from his mistakes, means that the war begins its tortuous turn in the other direction.
Well, something else that could maybe tease out from Mein Kampf is, as we said, he sets out his racial policy. But does this mean that in the captured areas, because the Germans steamroller the Russian army in these opening weeks, and they're occupying swathes of Russian territory. But does this mean that the captured areas are automatically vehemently anti-German, as Hitler set out his policy, what he wants to do with the Slavs and the Russians in Mein Kampf?
Yeah, that's one of the ironies. I mean, first of all, again, the two dictators have in common an ability and the will to use terror and force and mass murder to enforce their rule. And Hitler's armies invade the Soviet Union, and in those border areas in Ukraine, Belarus, and even part of Russia, many people initially, some of them welcomed the German troops. Others were at least not hostile to them, not because they knew anything about who Hitler was really and what the Nazis represented. They thought, they can't be any worse than what we've lived under. Stalin's terror, mass murder, man-made famine, secret police. And Hitler, if he had half a rational mind on this issue rather than an ideological one, would have been to instruct his troops to at least pretend initially to be liberating these territories rather than enslaving them. And same thing with the Soviet troops they captured. In many, these Red Army troops were totally unprepared for the onslaught because of the failures of Stalin's leadership. They massively turned themselves in and allowed themselves to be captured. This goes against the whole narrative of what was called the Great Patriotic War in the Soviet Union, that everybody resisted from the very beginning. In fact, while many people did resist, many troops did resist, many were captured, and they thought this might be their salvation. What they very quickly discovered was to be captured by the invading army was virtually, in many cases, a death sentence in and of itself. During that period of 1941 till February, I think it was 42, over 3 million Soviet troops were captured, and about 2 million of them died in captivity. Hunger, torture, or outright murder, shootings, and so forth. So if you were a Red Army conscript and you hadn't been captured yet, but you were getting wind of what was happening to the people who were captured, you say, my God, I better fight these guys with everything I've got because this is no salvation if I get captured. So it was, again, a self-defeating policy. So 41 is significant as the terror amps up on Hitler's side to the extent that it really dwarfs the much longer and more deadly terror up to that point on Stalin's side.
Well, you can add to that the commissar order as well, which is that aids in many respects Stalin, but giving his troops backbone.
Yeah, the commissar order epitomizes Hitler's mistakes. Because if you tell, and word spreads very quickly, that these political commissars in Soviet unions, no matter whether they're captured or are just found somewhere, are immediately to be executed. Well, if you're the political commissar of a unit, you're going to be damn sure you're going to motivate your men to fight to the last, because you know if you don't, you're going to be dead. So again, it was a totally self-defeating order. Some German generals were uncomfortable with it. They were uncomfortable with it mostly because it was self-defeating, not for moral reasons. And just the same way as some were uncomfortable with the fact that the invasion of the Soviet Union marked really the beginning of the full-scale Holocaust, the Shoah, or the Holocaust by bullets before the gas chambers were operational, where they sent in these Einsatzgruppen and these special killing squads to kill Jews in villages, towns, and cities. And most of the objections, if there were any, by the top officers in German command, was that this was diverting resources and demoralizing rather than there was something fundamentally wrong with this. But it created this climate of everything, mass murder, killing, torture is totally acceptable. And then the word quickly spread that, that Stalin's propaganda, which was ginning up to portray the Nazis as these invading barbarians, was essentially right.
I wondered if the biggest decision is indeed almost a lack of decision on the Eastern Front in 41, where he seems to dither over whether Hitler seems to dither over whether to whether to attack Moscow. Would that be fair?
Yes, I think so. I mean, despite Hitler's miscalculations, he still had a very good chance of taking Moscow during that first push. As you say, his troops had marched in and taken huge amount of territory in a short time, and the Red Army was totally outgunned at first and not prepared. And then by the summer, the Wehrmacht, the German army, is within striking distance of Moscow. And what does Hitler do? He suddenly says, no, we have Moscow as the political target, but our economic target, again, he's switching back and forth whether economics counts or not, is the Ukraine. And so we're going to swing a good part of the army south to take Kiev and what he says, the bread basket of the Soviet Union and the future bread basket of what he sees as the German Empire. And then we'll go to Moscow. Well, he takes Kiev, but again, at huge expense of logistics and men. The German armies triumph there, but at a huge cost. And by the time they're then ready to restart the drive on Moscow, Hitler says, okay, now we can go and we can have Operation Typhoon, which starts in September 30th. First, there are the autumn rains, which just turn Soviet unpaved roads into rivers of mud. And then, even by Russian standards, a very early winter and very for cold temperatures. The German troops are really bogged down and freezing, and their supply lines are vastly overextended, and the whole offensive stalls on the outskirts of Moscow. And by December, Stalin can order the first counterattack. So all this timing and these delays and these dithering, and it was almost as if Hitler had Moscow within his sights then in the first half of 1941. And then for some reason, and one of his generals speculated, maybe he was a little worried about the Napoleon example after all. He dithers and then diverts his troops and only then reconsiders. But that whole sequence of events only makes his chances for success diminish radically. So the man who had been this decisive leader, who had taken these really audacious steps often against the advice of some of his aides, now was the one who was dithering and refusing to listen to those generals like General Guderian and others, the famous tank commander, who were saying, go for Moscow, go for the jugular. That's the political center. That will be so demoralizing for the whole Soviet Union. If we take Moscow, then we are in a totally different position. But of course, they fell short.
It's not all just Hitler's poor decision making that makes 1941 key. We could turn the tables, remain in Russia and turn the tables and look at Stalin, because after some faulty decisions, he actually seems to start getting things right. After a faulty start. Would that be fair?
That would be fair. I mean, Stalin had a whole slew of faulty decisions behind him in terms of ignoring all the warnings he was getting from the West and from his own spies that Hitler was about to break back and invade. Instead of listening to those warnings, in Stalin's paranoid mind, all of this was a plot to force him into a war with Hitler that he did not want at that time. So he refused to believe anybody what was happening. But once the invasion happens, and by the way, he was in shock at first, and the Politburo members had to go to his dacha where he had isolated himself for a while and come to him to plead with him to come back into the Kremlin and to take command. And when they came out there, Stalin at first thought that he might be coming out to arrest him. But once he realized he was in command again, he began to make sensible decisions. They began massive decisions for massive evacuation of factories, of key personnel, of having an alternate capital in Kuibyshev, which was about 600 miles to the east. They actually put in explosives around Moscow in case Moscow fell. And word began to filter back to Moscow that Moscow was about to fall. And you had the situation on one particular day, October 16th, 1941, where there was a lot of officials had been leaving Moscow. A lot of factories had been closed up. People left behind were panicking. Workers were demanding their wages, protection. There was looting. There was chaos. The police seemed to have suddenly disappeared in this police state. It was an unbelievable scene. I interviewed many of those people who had survived in previous years and previous trips to Moscow, and in a state where everyone had lived in terror, suddenly it was anarchy. And a lot of people expected Stalin to follow many of his other officials and go into Kuibyshev, the alternate capital. Stalin realized he had to stay in Moscow. He actually went down to a special train at a train station that was waiting to evacuate him. He walked along the track and decided, it was as if he was thinking, do I get on or do I get off? And he walked back out of the station and stayed in Moscow. And word got around that Stalin is still here. We are still fighting. And of course, he then instituted draconian measures, martial law, had people executed who were seen as traitors or fearmongers. Yeah, typical Stalin terror. But the message got through that Stalin was not going to allow Moscow to collapse, and people responded, and the situation begins to turn around. The other way in which the situation begins to turn around is Hitler never trusted any of his generals. And all the advice he was getting from top generals about how to conduct a campaign, he'd routinely overrule, dismiss. And of course, there was a lot of self-serving accounts by some of the generals after the war of how they could have done things differently if only Hitler had listened to them. But there was a large element of truth in their complaints that Hitler had blown the strategic and tactical chances he had. While Stalin, while also famously not only distrustful of his generals, but he had purged so many of his generals, had them executed in the purges of the late 30s. During the war, he finally began to trust particularly one man, that was Marshal Zhukov, and who he put in charge of first the defense of Leningrad, and which then turned into the siege of Leningrad, but in the defense of Moscow, and to throw in their last reserve troops to try to fend off the German army. And it was Zhukov who managed to organize this rather scattershot defense against what was a very scattershot forward ranks of the German troops, neither side quite knowing how much the other had left. And then much more decisive policy and willingness to give Zhukov more authority began the counteroffensives. So Stalin, I do credit him with making the right decision at the key time in October of staying in Moscow and sending the signal that they weren't going to continue to fight when it could have easily gone the other way.
I think that's very much the narrative of 1941, that the Germans increasingly make poor decisions, or in fact Hitler increasingly makes poor decisions, whereas actually what will become the Allies at the end of 1941 start making some good decisions. So with Russia going on the offensive and holding Moscow, I wonder if we move to look at Britain at the start of 1941. The narrative is Britain stood alone, and admittedly, I'm British, and I've been brought up very much with the Anglo-centric view of we stood alone, but Britain never really stood alone in 1940, did it? Sorry, 41.
Well, not completely, of course. First of all, before we even get to the U.S., there were all the exiles who were coming in, and I happen to know this from my family history. My father was in the Polish army in 1939, managed to escape, was then ended up in France, and with French with the Polish units regrouping in France, then was evacuated by the British and became part of a paratrooper unit based in Scotland. So there were the Poles, the Czechs, Norwegians, various folks who were there, of course, playing a huge role, as it were, the pilots from especially the Polish and Czech pilots, as well as the Commonwealth pilots in the battle for Britain. So it wasn't completely alone. But what was going to be critical was the British-U.S. relationship. And Churchill knew that. And on a very personal level, he and Roosevelt really worked at that. As mentioned, there were people in the U.S. who were very strongly pessimistic about British chances and were saying, don't even help Britain because they're going to lose anyway. So any help you give is going to be wasted. And Joseph Kennedy, the ambassador, the U.S. ambassador, was a prime exponent of that view. Finally, he is replaced in early 41 by John Gilbert Wynand, who was a Republican, a former governor of New Hampshire, but a very strong opponent of the isolationist movement. And he and others begin to play a role in trying to bolster U.S. support. And there was a strong psychological battle to convince Americans who were, of course, reluctant to send our boys, that they put it, back to war in Europe, that you cannot abandon Britain. And there are all sorts of characters who I found really interesting, like the U.S. military attaché in London, General Raymond E. Lee, who was this Anglophile, and during the Blitz, at one point, he was so angered by the U.S. correspondents writing about how much London was devastated. He called them all into his office at the embassy, and he had a pile of dictionaries on his desk, and he said, "Many of you are saying London is devastated." Now, and then he reads them the dictionary definition of devastated. He said, "Look out the window. That city is not devastated. And in the opinion of this soldier, it won't be." There was this whole push to try to convince Americans that not only should they help Britain, but this was something they needed to do, and that was the right thing to do, and that it was the sensible thing to do because Britain could hold out, and therefore you should never give in to despair. And of course, Churchill was famous for his defiance and for projecting this attitude that of course we will win. But when you really examine some of the private diaries, recollections, and so forth, he too had his moments of doubt and near despair, but he would never show it. And so there was this great battle going on. And the other part of that battle was that the isolationists, someone like Charles Lindbergh, the famed aviator, really undermined their own cause. For instance, in the testimony, there was a big battle in the beginning of 41 about whether to pass the Lend-Lease legislation, which would allow the U.S. to become what Roosevelt said called the arsenal of democracy. When Lindbergh testified, he was asked by one of the senators, well, wouldn't it be better for Britain to survive, to Britain to win this war? And he said, well, not really. It'd be better if nobody won this war, because I don't think we should have either side victorious. And he refused to condemn German behavior or German aggression. He made it sound like everybody, all those Europeans, were just equally guilty of messing things up. And people were offended by that. Even then, these stories of German atrocities, of German what Nazi ideology meant in practice had begun to filter back. So this was a huge battle, but it was a delicate relationship between Churchill and Roosevelt. As much as he supported Britain's efforts, he was very indecisive about whether or not the U.S. should enter the war. He had pledged in his last campaign in 1940 not to take his country to war outright again. It took Pearl Harbor and it took Hitler declaring war on the United States for that to actually happen. Roosevelt, after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. declared war on Japan on December 8th, but not on Germany. It was only Hitler who declared war on the United States 3 days later. Now, you could say that Roosevelt knew that was coming and just preferred to have Hitler do it. But still, it showed that state of mind. And Churchill had to be very careful. He was pushing for more aid and so forth, and ultimately for U.S. involvement in the war, but without saying it outright.
Well, it sort of strikes me in 41. America seems to be at war without being at war. They passed Lend-Lease, which is starting to supply Britain with huge amounts of material. Yet their policy is active defence by the US Navy in the Atlantic, which is kind of seems like an oxymoron. So you're not at war, but you will actively fire back, which they did do.
Yes, they kept stretching the limits, and Churchill appreciated that. And that's why when he was under pressure from some of his own people, demand that the Americans actually get into war. He said, first of all, you have to realize in the U.S. it's Congress that declares war, not the president. He has to have the backing of Congress, so don't push too far. And look at what he's doing in practical terms. As you say, it's not just Lend-Lease, but expanding U.S. protection of shipping in the North Atlantic is huge because, in effect, that puts the U.S. at war on the high seas when necessary. So he felt that, as he said, the tide of events is moving in our favor. We're trying to nudge it along. And we have to trust that that will work rather than over demands that the U.S. go to war. There were people in Britain and among American officials who were very pro-British, who were often irritated at Roosevelt for seemingly, as they would say, following public opinion rather than leading it. That's a bit unfair and over an exaggeration, but that was the sentiment.
Well, I've always had the feeling with Roosevelt that rather than actually wanting to sort of push the issue of having to declare war, what he does is to push the issue to try and make someone declare war on America, so he doesn't have to be seen to have done it. Then America has no choice but to react, which again, it's like taking the decision out of his hands by giving someone else the agency to say, well, you make war on us, please, which is kind of nudging it along.
Yes, that was certainly the case, especially between the attack on Pearl Harbor and Hitler's declaration of war.
Well, I guess that brings us to the final major act of 1941, which is the attack on Pearl Harbor. Did the Japanese actually inform the Germans in advance of what they were doing? Because obviously they were part of the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy. So how much information sharing was there?
Yeah, one of the big contrasts I found in 41 was, as I mentioned, this line of communication, this open line of communication between Roosevelt and Churchill. They're constantly in touch. They're constantly exchanging letters. And by the way, early on, they set up a channel that bypassed, when Kennedy was still the ambassador, that bypassed Kennedy completely. And they would just have these letters going back and forth or telegrams going back and forth. And that's the way they built up that personal level of trust. Between the Germans and the Japanese, that was not the case. You had a Japanese foreign minister coming, for instance, to Germany in April, and they signed the tripartite pact. But even then, Hitler and his generals gave instructions, don't tell the Japanese that we are going to attack Russia soon. That was the biggest decision that the Axis powers could make, and yet he was not going to tell the Japanese. Similarly, the Japanese were not officially informing the Germans what their plans were about Pearl Harbor. And one of the big battles going on was the intelligence war, in which, for instance, Stalin was trying to find out what were Japanese plans, because as long as Japan was uncommitted which way it was going to go, there was speculation. Would they join the Germans, for instance, in the attack on the Soviet Union, invade from the east, which just sounded wildly impractical. But in here, Richard Sorge, his famous Soviet spy in Tokyo, finally was able to get the information that they were going to go to Southeast Asia first, although without the exact knowledge of certainly later of Pearl Harbor. That allowed Stalin to free up troops to defend from the Soviet Far East to help defend Moscow. But all of this was going on, and there was constant distrust between the Japanese, between Hitler and Mussolini. And again, it illustrates the relative weakness of the Axis and the relative weakness of Hitler, that he could not establish relations where you could really be as full-fledged partners. There was always distrust. But Hitler's reaction to Pearl Harbor was fascinating, because his reaction, just like he had thought his invasion of the Soviet Union would solve the British problem, when the invasion of the Soviet Union was bogging down in December, and the attack on Moscow was bogging down, and the German land army was suffering its first defeat, even though it was sort of a feeble defeat, nothing like Stalingrad more than a year later. He then welcomed the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and his thinking was the following: if Japan is going to bog down the United States in the Far East, And the U.S. will then no longer be able to help either Britain or the Soviet Union. And remember, the Lend-Lease Act was then invoked not only for Britain, but once the Soviet Union became an official ally, Lend-Lease supplies from the United States and from Britain began to flow to the Soviet Union and were essential to the Soviet war effort. But he said the U.S. will be totally diverted in the Pacific, and this will weaken Britain further and the Soviet Union further, and we will emerge triumphant. And after all, Japan has never, according to his version, never lost in 3,000 years. And so Hitler kept fueling his own illusions and self-delusions. And then by the time you have the Allies consisted of these three powers, the United States, Soviet Union, and of course Britain, versus Japan, Germany, and Italy, the disproportions are huge. The Allies have more than twice the GDP. They have almost 3 times the population and about 7 times the territory. Again, you cannot win against such odds in a long war, although you could still score short-term victories, and Germany was still capable of fighting that war for 3.5 years.
Well, it's paradoxical, really. At the end of 1941, the Germans, are still having victories in Russia, in the Middle East. They're still having tactical victories, but actually, as you say, in the long run, the foundations are set for their own defeat.
Absolutely, and that's why I think 1941 was such a decisive year, because there were more decisive victories for the Allies were coming much later. But all the preconditions for Germany's defeat were evident in 1941. With that alignment and with all the mistakes Hitler had made, it meant that there was no way Germany and Hitler were going to emerge victorious.
Well, that seems like a natural place to end. Thank you. It's been great to catch up again. If anyone wants to pick up a copy of Andrew's book, it is 1941, the year Germany lost the war. It's a great read, and I will put a link to it on the website. Don't forget, if you enjoy the podcast, you can become a patron at patreon.com/WW2podcast. Well, that's all for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.